name is Felienne Hermans. I'm here to present a case for feminism in programming language design. This is joint work with Schlesinger. Sadly, she's not here, so I hope she's on the live stream. And I want to talk, as I said, about feminism and programming language design. And maybe you're like, what? Like, what does feminism have to do with programming language? These are two worlds that I cannot reconcile. So I thought I will sort of meet you where you are, which I think is knowledgeable about programming languages. So we're going to start with an interactive, is it a programming languages quiz? And this is a super easy quiz. I'll just show you something that is a programming language. And if you think, yeah, that's a programming language, you raise your hand. And if you're like, nah, that's not a programming language, you do not raise your hand. That's the deal. You can also get extra points for guessing the programming language. So we will start with this. What is this? It is C. So is it a programming language? Yeah, so overwhelmingly people are like, yeah, C is a programming language. Okay, what is this? UML, yes. Is UML a programming language? Sort of 30%, I think. So what is this? It's a spreadsheet, yeah. So are formulas in the spreadsheet a programming language? Ah, not bad. Like 80%, I think. So what is this? Scratch, yes. So is Scratch a programming language? Oh, overwhelming majority, yes. Okay, so what is this? It's a knitting pattern. Bam! Yes. Is this a programming language? So there's 60%, I think. Okay, one more. What is this? It is HTML. Is it a programming language? Yeah, okay, so less than half, I would say. Okay, so what we have now established empirically is that there is something like programming language-ness, right? That some things are more or less a programming language, and there's general agreement on what is a programming language, but there's also some differences. Not everyone voted the same all the time. This is sort of what I thought the vote would be, which I think is more or less correct. Like UML is least a programming language, and C is most a programming language, and the rest is somewhere in the middle. And then I'd like to reflect on what is the process that we use to decide this, right? What do you do in your brain if you decide is something a programming language? What are the tools of thought for this? And I think there's generally two ways that people decide is something a programming language, and it's also something like a decision tree. One is it machine executable? Right? So this is something you can do. If a machine can execute it, then probably it's a programming language, and this has nice properties, and Scratch and C are programming languages, and UML is not really a programming language because it cannot directly be executed. So someone will say, yeah. Not directly, easily. So it can. So this is a nice division, but then if you just look at machine executableness, then many things are still a programming language, including HTML, which very often people are like, nah, you know, HTML is not a programming language, so maybe this is not a good division. There's another division that people very often make is it Turing complete? Right? And that has good properties because then you get HTML to not be a programming language, which is what you want, and then you get Scratch and C to be a programming language, so yes, this is good, but then you get side effects like Magic the Gathering then also being a programming language, which are probably also not what you want, right? So there is not a decision tree that you can use. There isn't an algorithm to decide if something is or isn't a programming language. And from that we can conclude that what is a programming language is a social construct. It is socially constructed what a programming language is, and this also changes over time. I am old enough to remember when Python, now the leading programming language in the world, wasn't a programming language because it was a scripting language. And then, like in the 90s, in the early 2000s, that was constructed socially as something different from a programming language. You either were a programming language like C, that had a compiler, or you were a scripting language used by script kiddies. So that even can change, right? And now sort of Python came into the fold of being a programming language. So programming languages are socially constructed, and that means if we want to study them, we have to use technology and tools that is talking about social construction. That is maybe feminism. And this, what is a programming language, for me, isn't an intellectual exercise. It isn't like, oh, I'll sit down in my Chesterfield and smoke a cigar and think, what is a programming language? Oh, so interesting. This is like, it is in my soul, it is in my heart. Because some people might know my research for a long time. When I was doing my PhD, I was working on spreadsheets. And I think I was doing really interesting things, bringing technology from software engineering to spreadsheets, like refactoring tools, unit testing, to help people that build spreadsheets build better spreadsheets. So I was like, hey, hello PL community, here I am, I do something super cool, I work on spreadsheets. And then the programming language community was like, that's not real programming. I was like, whoa, 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 wait, right? It is a functional language, it is reactive, which then was very cool thing to be a reactive programming language. Like, okay, I get I get that you're somewhat comprehensive about this, but look, it has all these features that are like programming languages, and many people can use it. And people are like, yeah, it's not real programming. I was like, wait, okay, no, I got it. I made a Turing machine. Look, I made a Turing machine in spreadsheet format. Now y'all have to be convinced, right? Look, it is Turing complete. And people are like, no, it's still not a real programming language. It doesn't matter, like because it's socially constructed, right? There isn't a proof that you can have. People are just like, no, spreadsheets is for normal people, for no programmers, so it cannot be a programming language. So then after a while, like I got like really depressed. I was like, I don't wanna work on spreadsheets anymore because this is not good, right? And it's super sad. I feel sad for my previous self that I couldn't pursue that line of research, and I just stopped doing that. And I almost stopped doing research entirely, actually. After this, I was somewhat done with academia, and I started to work in a middle school to teach programming to young kids. I thought, well, at least they will be nice to me, and they were. But then, I am a researcher, right? There's nothing I can do. So when I started to teach 7th grade, I saw all those interesting programming questions, and then I started to get warm again about doing research, but research and education. So I was like, okay, well, to get myself out of this depression, I will start to research how do 12-year-olds learn programming. And then I figured out there's a really nice community about computer science education research. And I was like, yeah, Felienne, that's awesome. You join our troop. You come to ICER and 60, all those programming education conferences, and you do research there. And like, yeah, this is so fun. I'm entirely alive. I feel better. And I lived happily ever after. The end. No, of course not, right? Because I am a programming languages person. Like, thinking about programming languages is just my thing, and specifically making programming languages so that more people can enjoy programming. Like, I think knowing programming is one of the biggest gifts that you can know, and next to knowing knitting. It is just so good, and I just want more people to have that. So when I saw all those 7th graders struggle so much with programming, I thought, what they need is a new programming language. So in the early 2020s, I created a programming language. It's called Hedy. Who's heard of Hedy, my programming language? Many people. Awesome, thank you. For the people that don't know, Hedy is not so important for this talk, but what Hedy is a simple version of Python that can be localized into different natural languages. So here you see Hedy in Spanish. We support 59 different languages. We also support right-to-left languages like Arabic. This also works. And that was quite an interesting technical endeavor to create a natural language version of different programming languages. So last year I went to Splash in Portugal, and I presented a paper about how to make a programming language in different languages, how to localize a programming language. And that wasn't computer science education research anymore. That's true PL work, because we happen to have applied it to education, but you can apply this also to professional languages. So I went to Splash last year, and I'm like, hey, I'm back. I swear it's not spreadsheets this time. It is a real language. Like, this cannot be denied. It is like Python, which is a programming language. It's just localized. And what I was ready for is people would be saying, why did you do that, right? Why? And I was like, I feel ready. Like, I feel ready. You know why? But people said, why is that hard? Why is that hard? And I think this is such an interesting question, because why does it matter whether it's hard? Why is that important? Like, maybe it took me 5 minutes to build this, but many people are enjoying it. When I showed this Arabic screenshot recently to someone from Syria, they were like, wow, I had never thought I would ever see a for loop in my own language. This is just something that touches hearts. So why do people care that it's so hard? But what happened is, I'm a normal person. I just want to fit in. So I entered this conversation. I was like, well, it is really hard. It is super hard. Look at me being a hard programmer, right? Because you have diacritics and word order and regional variance and numerals. It is super hard. Please accept my expertise, right? Be proud of me for doing this work. But while I was in this conversation, I sort of felt my soul leave my body. I was like hovering over myself and thinking, what are you doing, right? Why are you even dignifying this question with a response? Because it is not my value system that things are hard are good. I don't care if it's hard. I care if it makes people happy, and I care if more people learn programming through it. So then I went home, and again, I was sad. I was like, no, well, that was not the success I was hoping for. I don't feel at home in the programming language community. But then time passed, a few months passed, and then I was like, why don't I feel at home in the programming language community? Why? I am a programming language designer. I made a programming language, and I mean, many people make programming languages, but my programming language also has hundreds of thousands of users. So I can say I am a programming language designer, right? This is what I am. So if I don't feel at home in the programming languages community, maybe it's not me, right? Maybe something is there that is just special. So I was like, yeah, I don't feel at home. I don't feel at home. What do I have to do? Help. I have a case of the feelings, right? I don't know what to do. So I could sort of choose two things. It's like one, therapy, or two, science. So I mean, I'm a scientist. So I was like, okay, let me try science first. If you're still all mean to me after this, I will go to therapy, I promise. I was like, okay, so how do you study feelings? How does that work? I have a PhD in software engineering. I don't know how to study feelings. But then if you're a woman of a certain age, then you hang out in women of a certain age circles. So some of my female professors that I hang out with, they were like, Felienne, have you tried feminism? I was like, what? Do you mean feminism? I had no idea how feminism was going to help me, because what I envisioned feminism to be was individual liberties, right? Abortion rights, maternity leaves, women quotas, like the fact that tonight at Splash there is a women's dinner, right? That is what I understood feminism to be. And this type of feminism is called liberal feminism, and it sort of says, the world is fine, we just need to pipeline more women into all the systems, and then the problem will be solved. But this was the only type of feminism that I knew, and I thought, well, you know, I didn't need anyone's help to make programming languages, so I don't see how this is going to help. But then what I learned is there's so much more brands of feminism. One specific brand of feminism is called feminist epistemology, which is the knowledge of knowledge. And that type of feminism says, who creates knowledge? Who is involved in creating knowledge? And how does that knowledge get created? Is everyone allowed to participate in knowledge creation? And I thought, this sounds like what I need, right? Because I'm very interested now in how do programming languages get made, and who decides that, and that is knowledge, and how is that decided? So then what happened is I went back into my research diary, and I knew, like, I read something one time about this that might be helpful. And I found this paper. It's a 2016 paper that's called Glaciers, Gender, and Science. And I found this on Twitter, because then Twitter was actually quite fun, where you can learn about all sorts of things that weren't your own research field. And people were actually posting about this paper because they thought it was so silly that feminism would play a role in the study of glaciers, right? Because they were like, well, what does feminism have to, this is like me, right? What does feminism have to do with glaciers? So I'll tell you. There's actually two types of glaciers. I learned this from the paper. One type of glacier is high in the mountains in remote areas. And the other type of glacier is actually low and in rural areas next to where people live. So you could think, like, what type of glaciers would we have more information on? You audience, you may do a vote again. Do you think we have more data on easy to reach rural glaciers? Raise your hand if you think that easy data is oversampled. You see where this is going. So who thinks, yeah, no, the high glaciers, many, yes, but why, right? Why? Because it's harder to do. Why? Because it's harder to do. That is the thing. Because you can gain social status from climbing a high mountain. You can come down from the high mountain, go to the pub, and tell your friends, "Whoa, I climbed the high mountain today!" Oh, like, you can gain social status in that system. Whereas if you gather data where people live, then that is no fun, right? No one cares about that easy to get data. And I was reading this paper, and I was like, wow, so easy doesn't have value, and hard is really valuable. I was like, I learned more from this paper about the programming language community than existing in the programming language community for 2 decades, right? I was like, yes, this is us. This is us. If something is really hard, then you can gain value. You can gain value from proofs. You can gain value from Haskell and C++, but you cannot gain value from Excel or PHP or JavaScript, the easy stuff that everyone uses, right? So finally I understood the type of pushback that I was getting, because what I'm trying to do with Heady, and also before with spreadsheets, I'm taking something that is Python and I'm making it easier by making it localized. And I had never understood that there could be any frame of reference in which making something easier isn't good. Because like this is my drive is making stuff easier so that more people can participate. But if this is your frame of thinking, then making something easier is actually detracting value. So I was finally like, I get it, right? If you look at the world like this, then making something easier is bad, is not good. So then I thought, you know what I will do? I will take this entire Glaciers paper and look at the whole framework, which is a 4-part framework. Just take this framework and apply it to programming languages to see what else is very similar. Many things are very similar. So this is a quote from the Glaciers paper. Natural sciences have historically been defined by, and their credibility built upon, manly attributes. So that is this, right? That is the manly attributes, that doing something very hard is good. And of course that doesn't mean it's only for men, right? Women can also climb mountains. But that means that the value system rewards something that we typically associate with men, like being strong and being tough. But then this part is hard, right? This is not exactly the programming language community, because historically being defined by, well, wait a minute, our community is not always historically it has been defined by this, because there was a history in which all programmers were women. This is a Cosmopolitan from the 1960s that maybe some people have seen before. And here, all programmers were women. And they say stuff like, it's just like planning a dinner. Programming requires patience and an eye for detail. Women are natural at computing. Like, this too is sexism, right? But it is very interesting that at not even so long ago, like some people in the audience might have like been there in the 1960s, that then programming was female and it swapped to being male. So if I say something like a programming language is a social construct, I also mean this, right? Because in the 60s, apparently, a programming language was socially constructed as something that women were good at, and now it is reversed. So there's a lot of research about that early computing was very, very open to women. And this sets it apart from the science of Glaciers that has always been male and sort of remains male. Programming had to be made masculine. It was female and it had to be made masculine sort of by force. And one way that it was made masculine is that it was made mathematical. So early programming was all sorts of things, right? It was electrical engineering, it was linguistics, it was cognitive science, and then sort of mathematics came along, took programming in, and made it their own. So one person that was instrumental in this is Dijkstra. So here's a quote from an EWD, which are these blog posts or Twitter posts avant la lettre that Dijkstra wrote, and he says, I intend to present programming as a mathematical activity. And it's interesting, not just that he says this, but when he says this, right? Because apparently, if he says, I intend to present it, that means it's currently not mathematical, right? If everyone already agrees, you're not writing this, specifically not Dijkstra, because he also always wanted to write what people were not yet thinking. So this means it's not yet mathematical, and he writes this in 1973. So apparently, before it wasn't really mathematical. And this is 20 years after the first compiler and 30 years after the first computer, programming had to be made into math. And then what are his arguments? What does he say? Well, why is programming mathematical? He says, well, an inventive and effective mathematician will find challenge. Challenge! Come here, guys, the glaciers are very high. Come on, much climbing to be done, right? That is the argument. here, look, it is challenging, so I'll come here. And of course, it's not like Dijkstra made all the rules by himself, but it's clear to see that in all sorts of ways, and the essay actually describes this in much more detail, programming was made into math and therefore made smaller and smaller and much more into this manly characteristics. So what the Glacier paper also says is that most research stems from information by men, about men, with manly characteristics and within masculine discourse. So that is also, yes, that looks like the programming language community, right? Information by men, about men. Here's the history of programming languages, ACM, this big thing, the hop poll that they do sort of every 10 years. The most recent one had 46 authors, of which only 4 were female. And together, the 4 female authors only wrote 2 papers. So 3 were on one paper and 1 was on another paper. So, and this is 2020, right? This is not the 70s. And this just happens, right? And I don't mean to blame one individual person, but apparently we have this system in which this can exist, and no one stops this from happening. And it's not just academia. Here's a book that's called The Masterminds of Programming that talks about different programming languages. And I know quite some people use this book as a sort of an appendix also in a programming languages course, because it really nicely talks about how different programming languages were designed. I mean, it's a really nice book, but it interviews 27 people about 17 different programming languages, and literally all of them are male. So that's like, yeah, you know, that's not great. Like, some people are not included. And it's not even so interesting to only talk about the gender of the people that were interviewed. It's also interesting to look at what is in there, because UML is in there, and SQL is in there, right? And I get why you want to include UML, because Grady Booch is super cool. Like, he's an awesome human being. So I see how here you want to quickly move the goalpost to include UML so you can interview cool people, even though generally, like, we all sort of agree that UML is not so programming languagey. But that we can include because it has a value, whereas I'm like, yeah, but what about spreadsheets? And people are like, nay, not spreadsheets. So it is very much socially constructed, and then we live in a world in which this can just happen, and no one is super upset. So it's not just information by men about men, it's also this manly characteristics within a masculine discourse. And this is, I think, mostly reflected not in what we study, but how we study it. Like, what aspects of programming do we study? I think we can all easily agree that what programming is people put programming code into machines to make the machines do things. So that's like people and computers. But mainly in the PL community, what we study is the computers. We do proofs, we do benchmarking, we build stuff, and like, look, I build a thing. And what we do not really do is observing or interviewing. How do people use the tools that we use? It's sort of like, no, people will figure it out, or they won't. I don't care. It has nothing to do with me. And this, again, also, it is not a coincidence, right? It's not like, oh, just naturally we all grew very interested in computery stuff and we forgot about the humans. Here's another quote by Dijkstra that actually, if I read this quote, it makes me mildly angry. He says, by claiming they can contribute to software engineering, social scientists make themselves even more ridiculous. And then still, like, I have to live in this world and people are like, oh, Dijkstra, I'm from the Netherlands and I did my undergrad in Eindhoven, right? So it was like, oh, Dijkstra. I was like, yeah, I know, like, Dijkstra has algorithm, it's very smart, but also there was some problematic stuff there. So we see that still, that the stuff where social scientists could have helped us isn't being studied. So here's an actual paper that exists in the PL community. Like, there's nothing wrong with this paper, right? So it's not something specifically wrong, but what we can study is type systems with for high assurance verification of Rust programs. This is a paper that can exist. Or static information for flow control in Rust. These are papers that can exist. They can flourish. People build a career out of this if it's a POPL or a PLDI paper. But then there's also papers that just cannot exist. Like, the reason I have Rust here, because I think Rust is so cool because people love Rust. Like, somehow people go bananas for Rust in ways that I have not seen people be excited about. I don't know, Java or C. Even Haskell, right? People are like, oh, Rust, I'm a Rust station. They identify as being a Rust program. I think that's very cool, and I would like to know why, right? I would want to know, why do developers love Rust so much? I'm curious about this, But I cannot do this work because where would I publish it? And it's also not just, it's not a social studies thing, right? You need deep programming knowledge to do this work. Like, imagine I would actually do this. It's like, hey, why do you like Rust? And people are like, I really like the borrow checker. So then you have to understand memory management to say, okay, tell me how this differs from a garbage collector, right? So you have to know the lingo of the programming language to really make sense of what people would say. And here's another paper that I would like to do, but cannot exist, like when type systems get in the way. We all know that, yay, type systems, awesome, but sometimes you're like, I know that this works, but the compiler doesn't listen to me, right? Yes, exactly, you all know this. So I would like to sit down next to people, watch over their shoulder when they curse at the compiler and when they curse at the type system and to tell me what, right? Because this will make programming languages better if I can do this. If I can understand when a type system is harmful, then I can make a better type system. If I can understand why people love Rust so much, I can build better programming languages. But I cannot do these things because you cannot do this research because where would you publish it, right? And maybe some of you are like, no, Felienne, this work can exist. Because one time, 10 years ago, we had one paper at Onward called Socio-PLT. And this is an awesome paper. I love this. And this is a very, very nice paper that has actually looked at how do people adopt programming languages and what are the factors in that. This was a paper in Onward 2012. It even won Most Influential Paper Award. So you're like, oh, awesome. Sociology is cool. Many people will do this. No, many people will not do this. And I actually reached out to Leo Meyrovich for this paper. And I asked him, like, where are you now? And why is it not here? And he said something, it was so heartbreaking. He said, I know if I want to pursue this line of research, I have to have a POPL or a PLDI paper every year because that's how you build a career. And maybe I can do this once, but I cannot do this all the time because it's just a novelty thing. And specifically, he said, if I want to build a career out of this, I have to also do this with students. And I cannot force PhD students to do the soft stuff of PL because it cannot be published, right? You cannot build a career out of this. So he's no longer in academia. And I'm like, see, this is how hard it is. This is what the manly characteristics and the masculine discourse does to us, that some things are included and some things are not. So the Glaciers paper not just looks at the past, it also looks at the future. Like, how do those systems of power stay in place? And then maybe you're like, yes, Felienne, let's talk about the future because it will be great. Like, no, I have some bad news for you because it's really, really hard to change social systems. What the paper argues is that discussions perpetuate certain power dynamics, all sorts of different power dynamics. Once they are in place, they're really, really, really hard to change. For example, the personal dynamic that I have been in many conversations in conferences around the world where people are like, hey, what did you do? And it's not even like about spreadsheets or anything, but it's about how do I research? It's like, wow, I interviewed a few people and asked them what they thought. And people will say, interviewing is not computer science. Right? It's very hard to battle that level. Or people will say, yeah, what is qualitative work? What does that mean to do qualitative work? People that are laughing are also doing qualitative work, and they have read this question before, right? And then yes, it's true, thank you. And then you have to explain like the basics of your research methods. And of course, it's not a problem to explain what I'm doing, right? That's why we're at a conference. But imagine that if your research methods are non-traditional, then all your conversations are at this very low level. No, 10 is not a small sample size. No, there is no student t-test in this paper. So you can never really do interesting conversations, whereas the more mainstream you are, the more people have actually deep questions. They're like, oh, but did you read this? So when I was a grad student, all my fellow PhD students were always like, oh, I went to a conference and it was so great, I came back energized. And I was like, well, I came back depleted and sad, and like now I understand why. But it's not just interpersonal dynamics. It's also structural dynamics of power that, of course, in our community is not literally the law, but there are rules and there are also written rules. For example, this is the call for papers of POPL. So what does this say? How do you get something into POPL? Well, it has to be fundamentally sound. Okay, that's nice, but what if I want to do this Rust study, right? What if I want to study the principles on which people enjoy programming languages? And it has to contain sufficient information for other people to reproduce the results. But the goal of qualitative work is not to reproduce the results. The goal is to learn something and to build upon that from there. So that is POPL. I also have PLDI here. So they have in their reviewers guidelines 2 ways that you can look at a paper. You have to make sure that there are appropriate and clear experimental design and that there are relevant metrics. So only quantitative work can get in because I don't have metrics. And then I feel like the PLDI people, they are trolling me, right? Like, look at, they have an FAQ. They have an FAQ about their reviewing process. They say, hey, but what about human factors? I'm like, I would very much like to know what about human factors, you friends. No, sometimes PL involves user studies. However, those are currently relatively infrequent in the papers we examine. And why would that be? Right? So it's not even that they don't know. Like, they know there's an issue, but yes, I don't know. I don't know why there aren't any people here. So these dynamics, they perpetuate power through the centrality of math and technology. And you see that also with POPL and PLDI. Metrics, reproducibility, it narrows what you can do. And then, of course, that doesn't mean that you can never get anything else in, but it will be a lot harder to sustain a career on that type of work. So that is an overview of what is in the paper. There's much more in the paper in a lot of painstaking detail. But I want to sort of close it with, now what, right? What do we do now as a community? So I also don't know. I don't know. But as I was researching this paper, I felt so, like my heart was warmed sometimes. I was reading so much work on female programmers. There were so many researchers, male and female and other, that have researched how women feel in programming. And there's this one quote from one paper that I want to share, because it said, women can be coders or female, but not both. This is how people feel, right? This was an interview study in which female programmers were interviewed, and they felt, well, I cannot have my female identity. And I read this, it's like, this is me when I was younger. Like, now I'm here in a skirt and hoop earrings. But definitely, and I'm knitting in sessions. But I wouldn't have done that 10, 15 years ago because I didn't want to bring even more attention to my gender. I thought if I just have jeans and a t-shirt, no one will notice, right? So, and I know that won't work, but this is how I felt, and I didn't have the words. And reading all of that work sort of made me feel so seen, and that was good and nice. And I was thinking of this James Baldwin quote that says, you think your pain is unique, and then you read. I thought, that was me. So I was happy, but I was also sad. Sometimes my heart was also just cold, because I thought, why am I doing this work, right? Nothing uniquely qualifies me from doing all this work. Anyone in the community could have done this work. I'm already marginalized by being female and also doing all the qualitative soft stuff. Why do I also have to, for half a year, I wasn't working on my actual research agenda, I was working on this. So why do I have to do this, right? I would very much like to live in a world in which much more students had one course about critical theory in their undergrad, right? How is it that we don't live in a world in which computer science students or all technology students learn that, hey, you're building technology and all technology is socially constructed, also compilers and operating systems. And you have to talk about who is building this and why. I would like to live in this world, but I don't. Even more so, I live in the opposite world in which computer science programs and other technology programs tell students technology is neutral, right? This is math, so there's no people-y stuff involved. And then you have to keep doing this. So I was also sad, like, I would just like to build compilers, right? I don't want to do all this stuff. Why do I have to do this? But I don't know, therapy is expensive. So something else that I want to talk about is, we talk a lot, if we talk about diversity and inclusion, about bringing more women in. And that is good, right? I love it that there's a women's dinner tonight. That is really good. However, we also have to talk about what happens with women when they're in the system. If we pipe more women into this hard is valuable stuff, then this is the only way that you can think. And for some people that might just be a hat or a way of thinking that fits really good, but there's also a lot of women and also men that don't want to think in this way, and it's just very sad if we lose them. So if we want to get more diversity in all sorts of ways, then we cannot not examine the culture that we have, because a culture encourages some people to participate in some ways and discourages others. So we should sort of not only focus on getting more people in, we should also focus on changing the system. And I don't know how to do that, but probably some call for papers explicitly soliciting more qualitative work and explicitly finding reviewers that can review it. I think that is the way to go. So something that I would really, really like to exist is that gap that we have here, right? You have software engineering and HCI where some more qualitative work can exist. It can also exist in computer science education, but it now cannot exist in PL. So those studies about what makes people tick, what makes them enjoy, or what makes them hate a compiler, this work is not just not here, it is nowhere, right? We don't know, as a humanity, we don't know why people like a certain programming language. And we all know this, we know that there are certain things, but we don't have any theoretical frameworks for programming language understanding or adoption, and this is just a loss, right? So if we could just have a little bit more human studies into PL use, not instead of what we're doing now, but just in addition to what we're doing now, and not just on the fringes, right? People say, yeah, Felienne, but there's plateau and life. Yeah, but we all know you can't sustain a career on those workshops, right? It needs to be in the high-profile top venues, or it is not sustainable. The end.
We do have time for some questions.
I was going to say bonjour, but I can't remember what the French for good afternoon is. Mais je comprends pas. Non, je comprends la raison pour le choix de la langue de programmation. C'est la langue que les programmeurs comprennent, n'est-ce pas? Sorry, that's a cynical introduction.
You don't understand.
I don't think it's as bad as you think it is.
That is not a question.
I'm mostly going to advertise stuff, I think you do know what we need to do, and I think, frankly, we know what we need to do.
Okay.
Really, as I said, this isn't a question; it's an ad. So there has been a stream of, I'm tempted to say, feminist influence work that's been published at ICSI. In particular, there was work by Angela Martin, which I have a little handle in, which famously found out that the customers in Agile projects were working 80 hours a week, while all the male, and they happened to be women, while the programmers were working 40 hours a week. And more recently, there has been some stuff on choice of, things like choice of software architecture. Why do people choose a particular platform? And recently, and this is a blatant plug, there is a book just out this month published by Springer called Socio-Technical Grounded Theory by Rashina Hoda, who has just made full professor at Monash, who I'm very proud of. So I think one of the things that we can all do is, read that stuff.
Yes.
And cite that stuff.
Yes. So absolutely, and I think this was my previous slide that I was thinking on. The situation in software engineering and other fields in terms of qualitative work is much different, but I think it must also at least exist a little bit in PL.
Sure, because I think that's why I started speaking in French, because I think there are all kinds of questions that cannot be answered unless you take this at the very least or where you start thinking about the people rather than languages. That's different from studying languages and using people as a research instrument. Yeah. The question I would love to answer is why, I really shouldn't do this, but I'm going to do it anyway, I'm sorry. It was an interesting and very thought-provoking talk. I would love the answer to this question. Why did Haskell get away for 20 years with no static checks for a coverage of a pattern match at exactly the same time as the functional programmers were damning Java and every single object-oriented language because Smalltalk had a message not understood error, which is a non-coverage pattern
But
match.
these are the type of questions that
you can't do that, and
yes.
you haven't been able to do that.
But
in
I
Java
would now
ever.
very much like to hear some actual questions.
Sure.
So if we can move on.
Thank you. Thank you. The line is very long. We still have some time. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you very much for the talk. It was really something I didn't expect, that you actually took something more than liberal feminism and applied it to computer science. But I really wanted to ask you, if we introduce more social sciences into our research, wouldn't we also replicate just the masculinity in social sciences? Because I knew some social science, and it's just like the same thing replicated, maybe a little more like qualitative research, but it's still very manly in a sense.
Yes, so this is a great question, right? So all sorts of science suffer from these problems, some fields more or less. But I know also in sociology, quantitative work has a higher status than qualitative work. So we have to make sure that if we import that, then we do it in the right way. But whatever way we do it, we have to also look at people, right? So I don't know the best way, because that's not even my field. As I said, I'm just a simple programmer. But however way we do it, we have to include this human perspective, and that will bring more diversity in the people that do it, and also more diversity in the things that we do. But you are right, we have to do it in a careful way.
Yeah, thank you.
First of all, a little bit of validation. I really appreciate your call to action for making more qualitative work in our field. We've dipped our toe in the water several times, and the papers get accepted on the 3rd or 4th iteration. So we'll see about our interview study for Russ. That's on the 3rd try right now.
Yes!
Maybe we need venues for this, I don't know. But my question was actually about a comment you made, and I apologize for my great academic grandfather, Dijkstra, who, but you know, I wonder if you have thoughts on why math itself is coded in such a male way.
Yeah, that is a great question. So a little bit, there's some of that in the paper. I think, I'm not even sure if math necessarily is coded in a male way. It's more that the things we associated with men are more likely to stick, right? There's so much math in knitting and in quilting, but that part is also math, right? Have you ever made a complicated sweater? But then that math is not in the normal math, right? So what is the normal math? The normal math is also separated, divorced from people, right? It's always about algebra and abstract things. So if you're a person that likes people, and women are more likely to be interested in people, and we don't know if that is nature or nurture, but it doesn't even matter. So I would not even say math is so much male as math and other things are divorced from people, and that just impacts who wants to participate, who's excited about participating.
Hi, this is really cool. At I think it was Papa last year, there was this conference on the future of programming languages, and one of the panel members was suggesting that the reviews the call for papers, like you're suggesting, get expanded, and we start incorporating more crazy ideas rather than being sort of in the dead, stayed-like paths. And the response from the other members in the committee was, well, we don't want Popple to lose its rigor. And
that can go in my next version.
Yeah, right. So I was just wondering, like, how do I, as a young researcher, have conversations with people who are on these kinds of panels? Like, how do we start to have conversations with people who have the power in these?
Like, I don't know. I'm sorry that you had to go through that, right? So like one thing is I did a lot of work on this paper, so this is something you can share that maybe helps, but also if this culture is the way it is very hard to change, right? And in order for you to be in the steering committee of these conferences, you have to be well established in the current way of doing things. So it's really, really hard. So I think the best that maybe we can try for is at Splash, there is Splash E, which is a track about education, but it's in Splash. So maybe if it is a separate track, then at least the people are there and you have a group of people. So not a workshop, because a workshop sort of has a different status. But that is something that maybe you can make a safe space of qualitative people that is there but not there. But people that say, well, it will lose its rigor, right? This, I think, is very unlikely that we can change the minds of enough of those people to really change the field. So you have to make a space that has both the prestige and the safety somewhere. That's probably the best we can do. But like my concrete advice was, let's not do workshops because it is not enough of a status gainer.
I think we can take the 2 last questions, but
Cool.
we can switch laptops already.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you for the talk. I think these are really important issues to talk about. I'm wondering what the next steps are in terms of like what to actually do about it, right? And so, so one direction that I'm wondering about, and I'm wondering what your reaction is basically, if you want to show that something has value, then maybe try to have impact, right? And so the first people to do that are going to have a hard time, right? So the neural nets people work for decades and decades, and not having much impact as far as most of us know, and then all of a sudden, boom, right? And so I wonder what okay, it's questionable, right? But it's out there.
Yeah.
And so my question is, what can we do to show that these methods have impact?
Yeah, so I think it's really hard in the frame that we have, right? Because impact almost always means doing something that is relatively easy, right? Like getting people to adopt your stuff isn't hard technical work. So if you have something that is well used, then maybe that is even a proof that it is too easy, right? Because it should be harder. So I don't know if this is the way to go. I don't know if this is the way to go, right? Because then you have to show that you're doing this, you have to show that it's still rigorous, but also it has many people, which has a sort of tension. Like there's this great feminist thinker that says, Audre Lorde says, you cannot destroy the master's house with the master's tools. So if you go in this framework, you can never win. You have to do your own thing. That is something different, where you have a different value system. Because just saying, well, I mean, people look at my language and it's like, oh, it's for kids, right? Oh, it's natural language programming. It doesn't matter if many people use it, because it's a different bean counting.
Thank you.
So last quick question.
Quick question. So I thank you for that, and I think I'm in violent agreement with you. And I've been having these rants with many other people for like 20 years now in the hallways of these conferences, and in reaction to that, we've done some things. Like, for instance, you're speaking here at Onward, and Onward is very much a response to many of these issues. And Onward now is a conference in the ACM. I mean, your paper will get a DOI and be published in the ACM DL. And now we have the Programming Journal, which is a similar kind of community that is a real journal that is very much open to discuss a lot of these issues. So we've been slowly trying to infiltrate to fix these problems. And I just wanted to ask you if what we're doing doesn't seem good enough. What are we not? Well, yes. How is Onward and programming not yet good enough for you?
Yes. So I think this is actually a great question, right? Because it's really, really good that those things exist. This is awesome. But as you say yourself, the progress is somewhat slow. And to make it personal and go back to what I was saying in the beginning, the existence of these things has not protected me from sort of not feeling at home. And in every conference that I go to, every time having to defend the topic that I research, having to defend the ways that I do it. So however much I appreciate the things that you're doing, there has to also something to be changed. That if I'm in a conversation and someone says, oh, but this literally happened to me when I was a grad student. A full professor, when I was still a grad student and he was also male, said just in a room like this, oh, but this is not really computer science. And no one said anything. So, as long as we're there.
We have to organize and work together, because divided we fall.
Oh yeah, no, I agree with that.
Let's thank the speaker again.